Here is Sailor Studio 462, a turquoise ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
Here we have a light green leaning turquoise that, while turquoise isn't my thing really, it looks nice on the paper. And I'm gonna say funny because my notes are on Tomoe River paper and it's looking a little blue leaning. Doesn't do that on any of the other paper. Just an aside. There can be just a little tone variation by nib in the lighter tone. It shades well, and in the darker, it also shades just a bit more subtle. This is a solid performer on non-fountain pen friendly paper, but in general, it isn't entirely different as it is on the Premier papers. A real plus for this ink. Now, would I want a bottle of this? No, but because I'm not really all about the turquoise. But more important, would a lover of turquoise? Yes, without a doubt. This is a great ink that looks good on the page.
All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with a fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
The pen for today is a Pelikan P200.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine, we have a nice green leaning turquoise. It has no feather, it has no spread, it has shading, as you would expect sort of green leaning turquoise to have. Now with the extra fine, it's not especially stand out because of those thinner lines, but look at I on the first line. It's lighter than expect directly underneath it. To the just a little underneath that is could. Now could, you see, starts lighter and works its way darker all the way through the LD, where have next to that has a darker H and E than the AV in the middle. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade. I think while it's a more subtle shade that happens, I think it looks better than it did with the extra fine. Take a look at service on the first line, where the S is lighter than the ER and the VI lighten up a little bit through the C until the E gets darker at the end. Properly shading, look at properly on the third line. Where the P is dark, the RO lighten up a little bit, the P gets dark again. ER much lighter, and the LY really dark again. Looking at the stub nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade. Now, while the tone is the same as the extra fine, it shades better because of those thicker lines. It's much more stand out. Meanwhile, on the first line, looking at meanwhile, the M is lighter than the E, which is quite a bit darker. The ANW, ANW is much lighter. The the HI darken up a bit when the LE at the end is much darker. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting, no surprises.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Thorin would be happy on the second line, where the T is lighter than the H, that gets a bit darker. The OR in the middle lightens up a little bit. In at the end does get darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it shades pretty great. Look at great on the first line, where the G is a nice mid-tone. The REA lighten up a bit, and the T gets quite a bit darker at the end. The guards will certainly be happy on the second line, where the beginning of the G is lighter. It darkens up at the bottom of the G in the UA. The R and beginning of the D lighten up, and then it gets darker again at the end of the D into the S. Looking at the stub nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. I said this did really well on the non-fountain pen friendly papers, and it does. I mean, it makes you feel like you'd be wasting the money on good paper when this ink performs so well on all of them. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine, just a little bit more green leaning. So the same darkness, not the exact same tone, a little bit more of a green lean, showing it's a little bit of a translucent ink. Not a big deal, as it has no feathering and it has no spread. It shades just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. River trolls will not be happy when we look at River. That starts as a lighter on the R, darkens a little bit during the I, lightens again on the VE, darker on the R, where the trolls, the TRO, are a nice mid-tone. It's the first L darkens a little bit, the second L lightens some, and the S becomes very dark at the end. Well, very dark for what we're getting. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, still a little bit more green leading. I only really notice it because I'm looking at them side by side. It does not feather, it does not spread. There's no doubt that it does shading, looking at doubt on the second line, where the bottom of the D is lighter than the top of the D. It holds that darker tone that it has through the OU, but the BT darken up a little bit more, and the ED at the end a little bit darker still. Looking at the stub nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, though still being just a little bit green leaning because of this toned paper and being a little translucent. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, not in every single word. Flying on the first or on the second line, all one tone, but said above it has a nice darker S, lightening on the AI and beginning of the D. It's the up and down stroke of the D that get a bit darker. Look at that right next to that. The T is light, the H is dark, the A is light, the T is dark. Nice back and forth on each letter. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread. It shades just as well as the Clairfontaine did. On this quad rule, I was a little worried that it would sort of get lost with the quad rule. It doesn't. It stands out on its own beautifully. So if you use quad rule paper, this is a pretty good ink to use. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. However, looking at where it crosses the quad rule in some spaces, it doesn't seem to penetrate the paper where the quad rule is, giving some of the writing in certain areas a little bit of a choppy look. Looking at the stub nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It shades just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. The quad rule, again, I get some choppiness when it's crossing some of the up and down lines. Not so much the side to side, I don't write through those, and that would concern me if I was using this paper, and because I find that distracting. If you don't find it distracting, then it's no problem at all. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Aurora Turquoise.
Here is Noodler's Squitigu.
Here is Robert Oster Aqua. Here is Schaefer Turquoise. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just a little bit lighter and duller than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade. However, the quad rule here, the fact that this tends to dull an ink just a little bit, and this being an off-white in what's going on, I feel like what I'm seeing with the extra fine, it's just getting lost into that quad rule, so not the best paper for a student to use with this ink. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade, it does stand out much better. That little bit darkness, or a little bit darker, helps it, and it's only the tiniest bit darker. It really does help it stand out against this quad much better than it did with the extra fine. Also could come down to it's got some thicker lines to it. I would have really liked to see this a little darker here like the Clairfontaine, because it would have been perfect. Looking at the stub nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, tiny bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade. Can you feel the excitement on the first line? Where the E is dark, the X starts to lighten a bit. The the I lighten up, the CI lighten up a little bit. The T gets quite a bit darker. The E gets lighter. The MEN even lighter than that, where the T gets quite a bit darker. I still don't think this really works against the quad rule. That little bit lighter is not helping it. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page. Here is Robert Oster NG Special. Here is Monteverde Purple Mist. Here is Pelikan 4001 Brilliant Black. Here is Diamine Firestorm Red. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Now it does feather and it does spread, and there's a tiny spots of shading that do occur. I think the feathering and the spread that go on here are manageable if this is what you're dealing with. Would I be especially happy with it? No, but I would not call this the worst thing in the world. I don't think you're non-fountain pen friendly, or your non-fountain pen people, so they're not fountain pen friendly, Your non-fountain pen people, I don't think they'd really even notice. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It feathers, it spreads more than it did with the extra fine. I don't find this nearly as usable. Look at Father's Daughter on the second line. The amount of feathering that's going on there is really just not for me. It's just crossing that line of starting to look a little bit blurry, and I don't know that my old eyes can handle that. Not a lot of shading going on, but it's copy paper. Looking at the stub nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium. It is just a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. I don't think the feathering in a spread is as bad as it was with the medium, but I still wouldn't be especially happy as I traveled across looking at some of the letters, especially in traveled on the first line. Now there's a couple of spots that are a little bit darker, light seasoning of some shading. I think you could use this. This would be much better than the medium in my opinion. Looking at the back of the page, there's very little ghosting when it comes to that stub. It did get a little deeper in there. The medium and the extra fine had a whole lot deeper ink, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath, and I don't think you could use the back with the extra fine and the medium. The stub, that might be an up to you.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The extra fine was a cool tone with some nice shading. Now the medium was a bit darker and also shaded really well, just a bit more subtle. The stud looked like the stud of a pen. That pen was the Lincoln. It was a stud of a pen. The stub nib looked exactly like the extra fine, but with the wider lines, of course. So for me, I didn't really care much for the lighter tone of the extra fine or the stub. It just kind of missed the mark, but did really enjoy the darker tone that I got from the medium nib, especially what you're seeing from this Pelikan P200, which is a wet pen. That's why I go for a wet medium nib for this in all its glory. Now go out, ink a pen, and write something.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.